पेंडू ਆਸਟ੍ਰੇਲੀਆ ਦੀ ਇਸ ਪੋਡਕਾਸਟ ਸੀਰੀਜ਼ ਵਿੱਚ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ। ਪਿਛਲੇ ਦਿਨੀ ਲੰਘੇ ਐਤਵਾਰ 24 ਅਗਸਤ ਨੂੰ ਪੂਰੇ ਆਸਟ੍ਰੇਲੀਆ ਭਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਲਗਭਗ 40 ਥਾਵਾਂ ਦੇ ਉੱਪਰ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡੇ ਪ੍ਰੋਟੈਸਟ ਹੋਏ, ਜਿਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਲੱਖਾਂ ਦੀ ਗਿਣਤੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਪਾਰਟਿਸਿਪੇਟ ਕੀਤਾ। ਇਹ ਪ੍ਰੋਟੈਸਟ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇਜ਼ਰਾਈਲ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਗਾਜ਼ਾ ਉੱਤੇ ਨਸਲਕੁਸ਼ੀ ਕੀਤੀ ਜਾ ਰਹੀ ਆ ਉਹਦੇ ਖਿਲਾਫ ਸੀ ਅਤੇ ਆਸਟ੍ਰੇਲੀਅਨ ਗੌਰਮੈਂਟ ਤੋਂ ਮੰਗ ਕੀਤੀ ਜਾ ਰਹੀ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਆਸਟ੍ਰੇਲੀਆ ਦੀ ਗਵਰਨਮੈਂਟ ਇਜ਼ਰਾਈਲ ਨਾਲੋਂ ਤੋੜ ਵਿਛੋੜਾ ਕਰੇ। ਇੱਥੋਂ ਦੀ ਸਿਆਸਤ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਮੁੱਦਾ ਕਾਫੀ ਭਖਿਆ ਹੋਇਆ। ਇੱਥੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਐਡੀਲੇਡ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਲਗਭਗ 10,000 ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਪ੍ਰੋਟੈਸਟ ਕੀਤਾ ਸਿਟੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਮੰਗ ਕੀਤੀ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਤੋਂ ਕਿ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਇੱਕ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇਹ ਹਿੱਸੇਦਾਰੀ ਪਾ ਰਹੀ ਆ ਗਾਜ਼ਾ ਦੀ ਨਸਲਕੁਸ਼ੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹ ਬੰਦ ਹੋਵੇ ਅਤੇ ਇਜ਼ਰਾਈਲ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਪ੍ਰੈਸ਼ਰ ਪਾਵੇ। ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਸੇ ਵਿਸ਼ੇ ਦੇ ਉੱਪਰ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰਨ ਜਾ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ। ਸਾਡੇ ਅੱਜ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਦੇ ਮਹਿਮਾਨ ਨੇ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਐਡੀਲਾਈਡ ਪ੍ਰੋਟੈਸਟ ਔਰਗੇਨਾਈਜ਼ ਕੀਤਾ ਸੀ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਨਾਮ ਹੈ ਮਾਈਕ ਖਿਜ਼ਾਮ। ਇਹ ਇੰਟਰਵਿਊ ਪੂਰੀ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ੀ 'ਚ ਹੋਊਗੀ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਮਾਈਕ ਸਿਰਫ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ੀ ਬੋਲ ਸਕਦੇ ਨੇ। ਇਹ ਵਿਸ਼ਾ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਲਈ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਟ ਲੱਗਿਆ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਐਡਾ ਵੱਡਾ ਪ੍ਰੋਟੈਸਟ ਐਡੀਲਾਈਡ ਵਿੱਚ ਅਤੇ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਅੱਗੇ ਸਿਡਨੀ ਦੇ ਹਾਰਬਰ ਬ੍ਰਿਜ 'ਤੇ ਸ਼ਾਇਦ ਬਹੁਤਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਦੇਖਿਆ ਹੋਊਗਾ। ਐਡਾ ਵੱਡਾ ਪ੍ਰੋਟੈਸਟ ਹੋਣ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਵੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਦੇਖੀਏ ਤਾਂ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਸੀਗੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਗਿਣਤੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਨਾਮਾਤਰ ਸੀ। ਤਾਂ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਲੱਗਿਆ ਕਿ ਸ਼ਾਇਦ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਭਾਈਚਾਰਾ ਜੇ ਇਸ ਨਸਲਕੁਸ਼ੀ ਬਾਰੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਲਾਈਵ ਸਾਡੇ ਫੋਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਉੱਪਰ ਹਰ ਰੋਜ਼ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦਿਖਾਈ ਦੇ ਰਹੀ ਆ ਇਹਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਸ਼ਾਇਦ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਜਾਗਰੂਕ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ। ਤਾਂ ਮਾਈਕ ਨੂੰ ਜੀ ਆਇਆਂ ਆਖਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਹੁਣ ਇਹ ਕਨਵਰਸੇਸ਼ਨ ਸਟਾਰਟ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਮਾਈਕ, welcome to Pendu, Australia. It's been an honor to have with you.
Thank you, Roshan. I'm pleased to be here.
Yeah, thanks. To start off, could you please tell our viewers about yourself? Who is Mike Khizam and what led you on this journey of doing what you are doing?
Sure. So my parents came from Lebanon after the Second World War. So I'm part of the Arab Australian community. And because of that background, I've always had an interest in, I've had an interest in politics, so I was interested in the Palestine issue, which is has been an international issue for 77 years. The issue is something that has affected Australia's relations with the Middle East, and it's affected the attitudes of people within Australia. So it's been a significant issue, and I've been a student of the issue for a very long time. Mm-hmm. In recent years, I've been involved with an advocacy organisation called the Australian Friends of Palestine Association, and we were the organisers, the primary organisers of the march last Sunday, and we've been a very active organisation, particularly since October 7th, but over many years. Our basic aim, what we try and do, is to get the Australian public to better understand what the issue is about, what the conflict between Israel and Palestine is about, and what we think are the paths forward to a solution. Because this is an issue which has dragged on, a conflict which has dragged on for a very long time. It's taken a terrible toll on people, particularly in the last 2 years. And we think Australia has a role to play as an international citizen, and our concern is that our government's foreign policy when it comes to Israel and Palestine is not a balanced one, and so our goal is to try and move the government through direct representations, through lobbying, but also through raising awareness amongst the population about the issue to indirectly make the government take a position which we think is more likely to bring about peace in the region.
Before we deep dive into the history of this conflict, can you walk us through the chain of events that were taken place on October 7? What exactly happened on that day, and how things unfolded after in the months that followed?
Happy to do that. I'd say first that from our perspective, we recognise that there was 75 years of conflict before October 7th. Mm-hmm. and that after October 7th there's been the destruction of Gaza and a genocide. So we recognise that October 7th is very significant. Where I think we disagree with the government and much of the mainstream media is they seem to be willing to forget about everything before October 7th, which is the context, and they are not as interested in the human suffering after October 7th, which is the repercussion. They're focused on October 7th, which is what is important to Israel. But what we saw on October 7th was a militant group in Gaza, Hamas, which is an Islamic group, which had won an election for all of Palestine in 2006. But then there was a dispute with other Palestinian groups, and Hamas came to be in control only of Gaza. Gaza is a very small area. It's about half the size of the city we live in here in Adelaide. Gaza has been under siege by Israel with the assistance of Egypt, which shares a border with Gaza. They've been under siege since 2007. So not long after Hamas was elected in a fair election, as witnessed by international observers. That siege can cover everything in the sense that Gaza has to get fuel to come in to power generators for electricity. It cannot produce enough of its own food. Water can be desalination and purification need electricity and need fuel. Pharmaceuticals have to come in, and of course businesses in Gaza need to be able to export. So Israel completely controlled Gaza, and the siege at various times attempted essentially to put the maximum amount of pressure on the citizens of Gaza to try and overthrow the government in Gaza. So that was the reality before October 7th, and it was a reality that was evident, as I say, since 2007. And to give you a small insight, I saw a report on the ABC a few years ago where an Australian journalist went to Gaza, and she was accompanying a busload of people from Gaza to the Egyptian border who were going out of Gaza for medical treatment. And I still remember it to this day. One of the people was this young woman. She couldn't have been more than 20. She was going for cancer treatment, and the border guard turned her back.
So border guard from
Israel turned her back and said, "You're not going to go through." They don't have to give a reason. And I was very struck by that, because the journalist presented this woman who was just an ordinary person with a life-threatening illness going to get treatment, but the border guards have the power of life and death over people. And this is because the Israeli government gives them that power. At different times, ridiculous things have been banned from Gaza. Pasta, so people can't make spaghetti, a basic staple. Sheet music for musicians has been banned. At different times, the most ridiculous things are banned.
It's banned by Israel?
From going into Gaza.
Going into Gaza, okay.
So Gaza has been squeezed for 18 years now. Where there's been resistance from Hamas, the Israelis have used the most brutal means. So in 2008, 2009, a major attack was launched on Gaza. And people need to understand that the Palestinians have no army, they have no navy, they have no air force, they don't have anti-aircraft systems. It's essentially their defense relies on men on the ground. And the Israelis are not just the biggest conventional power in the Middle East with the most up-to-date weapons like the F-35 fighter bomber from the United States, but they're also a nuclear power. And they have the ability to strike anywhere in the Middle East, and usually the people cannot strike back, though we saw with the early on in the Gaza war that they were struck back from Lebanon, and then with the Iran war, they were struck from Iran. But Israel is the major military power in the region. The Palestinians are essentially defenseless against them. Mm-hmm. So the Israelis have launched, I think this current war is the 7th major attack on Gaza. Mm-hmm. And what we tend to see is overwhelmingly civilian casualties. Mm-hmm. And on the Israeli side, the casualties will be relatively small. On the Palestinian side, they'll be huge. And we've seen this pattern repeat itself. So we see the Hamas attack on October 7th as an attempt to break a situation that had been going on for decades. Okay. And the situation is not just the siege of Gaza, which has been there since 2007, but the fact that the path forward for Palestinians, whether in Gaza or in the West Bank or East Jerusalem, is not a path forward to freedom, to self-determination, to dignity. Mm-hmm. All the Israelis are offering living under a military dictatorship, that is their military occupation mm-hmm. of the West Bank and Gaza and the siege, the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the siege of Gaza. They're offering that, or they're offering expulsion from the country. So I'll come back to the realities of what we describe as modern Israeli apartheid a bit later. But we see the Hamas attack very much in that context of trying to break a situation which was impossible for the Palestinian people and offering them no hope at all. Mm-hmm. So as an organisation, Australian Friends of Palestine condemns attacks on civilians by whoever does it. So we have no problem in saying we're against attacks on civilians. But what we also recognise is that it's internationally acknowledged that people have a right to resist oppression and the occupation of foreign armies. Mm-hmm. It's acknowledged in the UN Charter, and it's acknowledged in societies around the world that you have a right to resist if an army comes in and you are living under the guns of a foreign military. So we accept and we support the right of Palestinians to resist oppression and to resist occupation. That doesn't mean that we support every organisation or every resistance act of every organisation.
But on October 7, so what was the casualties on Israeli side? And because there is an argument that many of the casualties took place because it was IDF who was shooting blindly on the people who came from Gaza.
Yes,
actually.
Yes. So initially we were told that there were something like, I think, 1,400 Israeli casualties, and around 300 were military casualties. Mm-hmm. That is Israeli military, because they have bases around Gaza. And we were told the rest were civilians. And then gradually that figure came down, and I think it's sitting at about 1,100 now. But one thing which didn't come out immediately was that the Israelis have a policy of not allowing or trying to prevent hostages being taken, Israeli hostages being taken by the Palestinians. And the reason they have that is because the Israelis have thousands of Palestinians in prison. And when the Palestinians take hostages, they can then bargain to get their own people out. Yeah. So this is the basis of the hostage or prisoner situation. So what the Israeli policy has been is to employ what they call the Hannibal Directive. Okay. And this means that if Israeli military forces see Israelis being taken captive, mm-hmm. that they prefer to kill the Israeli captives rather than have to negotiate to get them back. Mm. And it's now been admitted by the Israeli Defense Minister that this instruction, the Hannibal Directive, was used on that day. But even at the time, people looked at the destruction that was being blamed on the Hamas raid. They saw so many cars that were just burnt, and they asked themselves, how could the weapons that the Palestinian forces that came in, how could they do this amount of damage? And they looked at some of the homes in the kibbutzim, the Israeli settlements around Gaza, and they said that this damage is not consistent with the small arms or rocket-propelled grenades that the Palestinian forces had. They're consistent with tank fire, because people knew what Israeli tank fire looked like. So from the very beginning, people were questioning how many of the people that died on October 7th died at the hands of the Palestinian forces and how many died at the hands of the Israeli forces. And then we had Israelis who were involved in those attacks, civilians, who said, no, the Israeli tanks shelled us, and we told them we were held hostage. We had a number of international reporters that went and observed the damage, as I said, and said, look, the damage we're seeing and the types of destruction of property, cars, and the damage to people is not consistent with what the Palestinian weaponry was. Rather, it's consistent with rockets fired from Israeli helicopters or shells from Israeli tanks. So October 7th was taken by Israel as a basis for a declaration of war against Gaza, against Hamas, and they also sought to make it as big and as terrible as they possibly could. And so there were then other stories about mass rapes, which were later debunked even by sections of the Israeli media. There were stories about atrocities against children and beheading of babies, which were also debunked by the Israeli media. But when countries want to go to war, if they can give their population and their soldiers a sense of outrage, then it's easier to mobilise them to war. And this is how we see October 7th. We accept that innocent Israeli civilians were killed. We acknowledge that Israeli soldiers maintaining that siege were killed, but we also say that the death toll may owe at least half of its number to the actions of Israeli forces.
And what followed October 7th?
So October 7th saw the Israeli government come out and firstly make a declaration of war, but then they proceeded with measures which weren't just about fighting a military organisation, fighting Hamas. They were measures designed to inflict severe pain on the civilian population. And what I mean by that are things like the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu coming out and saying, making a biblical reference to a biblical enemy of the Jewish people, Amalek. And he said, remember Amalek, and remember what Amalek has done to you. Now, this is seen as an instruction for genocide.
Could you please tell our audience what Amalek means?
Look, Amalek was a figure in biblical history, a historical enemy of the Jews, and the instruction that was given to the Jews is to kill Amalek, and that meant killing not just the enemy but their children and their animals and destroying everything. So this biblical reference, which we've seen before with enemies of Israel being called Amalek, and it has meant, it has been basically an endorsement of kill everybody, not just military, destroy everything. So the Prime Minister of Israel came out with this statement on television to his country, and it was broadcast around the world. And it was soon followed by the Defence Minister, and he said, again, televised, we will cut off food, water, fuel to Gaza. Now, Gaza is completely dependent on getting things from outside to survive. It's a small territory, and to cut off the means of subsistence is a declaration of war against the civilian population. So it's saying we're going to starve you, we're going to leave you without electricity and fuel, and medications were in that. So this was the instruction from the highest levels of the Israeli government. And then we saw a policy of massive bombardment of Gaza, and a policy which saw thousands killed within a few weeks. And even from the very beginning, it was quite apparent that the majority of casualties were civilians. Often people talk about the number of women and children killed. That's not because the lives of innocent men don't matter. It's because it's clear that children and women aren't military forces. You can't disguise that. But it's now been admitted through a leaked report from the Israeli military that about 83% of the casualties in Gaza are civilian.
Okay. And what's the death toll till this day?
Look, the conservative figure is about 62,000, with probably maybe 3 times that number wounded. Okay. And I say a conservative figure because the death toll in Gaza was determined by people taking the bodies of the dead to hospital, or people dying in hospital and their names being registered. A lot of people never made it to hospital. They would either be under buildings that were bombed and still not recovered to this day, or just blown to bits and there's nothing to take and nobody knew that they were there. So that's why I say a conservative death toll of about 60,000. But in addition, the destruction of Gaza has been the destruction of everything. The bombing campaign has been across the entire length and breadth of Gaza. An intense campaign where satellite photos will allow you to do a comparison between before the bombing and after. And before the bombing you see all the normal elements of life: roads, houses, schools, shops, hospitals. And after you see a uniform grey landscape of rubble and broken buildings. Now most of Gaza is like that. Up over probably 80% of buildings have been destroyed or significantly destroyed. So the damage has been phenomenal, and this destruction has happened over the heads of the people living in Gaza. So it has been a campaign which has been very much targeting the civilian population, I think both in terms of punishing them, but in also to try and get them to overthrow the Hamas government. But the Israelis, on the one hand, will talk about fighting Hamas, and on the other hand, they will talk about measures against Palestinian civilians, which we've seen them enact, which are now considered, even by Holocaust scholars, to be genocidal.
And if not on October 7, what do you think this conflict truly began on what date? So could you tell us a brief history of long Palestinian struggle? What do you think, what's the right place right time to start with? 1948 with the founding of Israel, Second World War, 1917 with Balfour Declaration, or even earlier?
I think a good starting point for the general audience, I'm happy to go over the history, but a good starting point for the general audience is the peace accord signed in 1993. So that's only the Oslo Accords. Yes. Now these were brokered by the United States government between the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, and the Israeli government. So this agreement signed in 1993, 32 years ago, allowed for a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. And many people talk about a two-state solution as being the best solution for the conflict, because there are two peoples there. There's Israeli Jews and there's Palestinian Arabs, who can be Muslim or Christian, but they're mostly Muslim. So a two-state solution is something that, particularly in the West, they see as a path forward. An agreement was signed for a two-state solution 30 years ago. But what happened in between then and now is that the Israeli government continued to put in Israeli Jewish settlers in that part of the territory that was supposed to be a Palestinian state. So while having signed an agreement to have a Palestinian state to lay a basis for peace, they would on a daily basis undermine the possibility of a Palestinian state by settling their own population there. The Palestinians, after the 1993 agreements, have a sort of a government. It's called the Palestine Authority and Palestinian Authority, and its powers are extremely limited. It cannot stop Israelis settling in the Palestinian territories, what we call the West Bank, which is the west bank of the Jordan River, East Jerusalem and Gaza. So the Palestinian Authority has no power to control the Palestinian territories. They can't stop the Israelis settling there, they can't stop land confiscations, they can't stop Israeli troops arresting people, they can't stop detention without trial, which the Israelis use, because the Palestinian territories are run under military law. The Israeli military controls it. And so Palestinians, their authority has no power, and the Palestinians have no power over the Israeli government, which rules their lives through its military. So the reality in the occupied Palestinian territories is that there is ongoing colonisation, and that colonisation by Israeli Jewish settlers is now has gone to the extent that there's now about 800,000 Israeli Jewish settlers in the Palestinian territories. Okay. And so it's not like there's two communities living side by side peacefully. Israel is actively colonising its neighbour, the Palestinian community, Palestinian territories. And that colonisation is aimed at incorporating all of those territories permanently into Israel, but into Israel on the basis of it's a Jewish state. Yeah. So the people living in those territories will never get a vote. They will never be citizens. They won't have the rights that we enjoy here. They will live under some sort of military rule or some sort of apartheid setup. And for those that aren't familiar with that term, apartheid is a term that came from South Africa, where from I think 1948 till about 94, the South African government was representative essentially of the white population, not the black population or the coloured or the Indian population of South Africa. And they sought to maintain, as a minority, their control over South Africa. And so they set up a system of apartheid, which is keeping the populations apart, but also of unequal power and access to resources and control of land and things like that. So it was a system which relied on force and repression, and it was internationally condemned. What we see in the occupied territories today, in the West Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza, is the system of apartheid again in practice. And this has now been...
When you say Israel is an apartheid state, how does it look on the ground, like for common Palestinians? Could you give us some examples?
Sure. So there are things that are very visible if you go to the Palestinian territories. Firstly, there's a very oppressive military presence. There are Israeli soldiers everywhere. Most Palestinians are not armed. There are Israeli soldiers all over the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, and now they're in Gaza. The soldiers can shoot you and you have no recourse. They can claim that they were attacked or whatever. So it's an atmosphere of fear that exists. Control of movement is something that's very significant in that they have checkpoints all over the place, and this controls the movement of Palestinians. And what that can mean on a daily basis is that you need to go to work, you can be stopped. You need to go to your fields to do your annual harvest, you can be stopped until it rots. You need to go to hospital, you can be stopped. If you need to move, you can be pressured and blackmailed to get that permission. So life is controlled through control of movement. It's controlled through massive surveillance. It's controlled through the use of informers. It's controlled through the presence of the Israeli military everywhere. And there are other even more stark aspects of the Israeli presence, because what this colonization looks like on the ground is you have these huge Israeli settlements. So the Israeli settlers, when they go into the Palestinian territories, they don't go and live in Palestinian towns. They build purpose-built Israeli settlements. These tend to be on hills, top of hills, and they look like fortresses. So there's around 200 of them, and some of them are small cities, some of them are basically small encampments. But about 200 settlements with about 800,000 Israelis. So these are very visible on the landscape. There are roads, highways that connect Israel to the settlements in the Palestinian territories. Palestinians can't use those roads. Those are for the security of the Israelis going to live in the colonies. The Israelis built a gigantic wall around most of the West Bank after an uprising in 2000, and it was initially done on the pretense of creating security. But this wall, which is as high as 8 meters in some places, is also used to take Palestinian land, because the wall is supposed to run around the border of the Palestinian territories between the West Bank and Israel. But it actually goes into the West Bank, and so it takes territories that way. But it also, again, completely disrupts the Palestinian community. So to give you a small example, we had the mayor of Bethlehem, which is a Christian town in Palestine, and she used to travel to Jerusalem, which is a sacred city for Islam, for Judaism and for Christianity. It was a 10-minute drive for her. The Israelis built this wall, and now as a Palestinian she has to spend an hour to do a 10-minute drive, if she's allowed through, because these checkpoints are everywhere. So the presence of the occupation is very, very visible.
I have heard, is there a law in Israel that if you are a farmer, so you can dig that much deeper, but if you are a Jew farmer, you can dig deeper for the water?
I don't know about a specific law, but I know that there are major restrictions on Palestinian use of water resources. So the Israeli state gets a lot of its water for drinking and agriculture from the Palestinian territories. And there are controls as to how much water people can access and who can access it. And again, to give you a small example, if you're a settler in the West Bank, for instance, the amount of water you're allowed to have as a settler in the Palestinian territories is far in excess of what a Palestinian would have. Okay. So it even goes down to that level. Now, under international law, if you occupy a foreign territory, it's illegal to do things like exploit the resource of that territory. It's seen as a form of theft. Israel exploits the resources of those territories. while at the same time denying free use of them to the inhabitants there.
So you started with Oslo Accords. So if I go like in the time of when Israel was founded, so there was before that there was a Zionist movement. Could
Yes.
you please tell our viewers what Zionist movement was and what role it played in the founding of Israel?
So this goes to the heart of the problem. So if you only need to go back in history 130 odd years. Palestine was a part of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. It's on the Mediterranean coast of the Middle East, and its population was overwhelmingly Muslim, with about 10% Christians and a few percent Jewish people that were living there. So it was essentially an Arab Muslim country, part of the Ottoman Empire. At the end of the First World War, the British, who had been fighting the Turkish Empire, came into possession of Palestine. But before that, you had developments in Europe which were to change the future of Palestine, and this was the rise of the Zionist movement. Zionism is essentially Jewish nationalism. For a lot of people, Judaism is a religion, but for some Jews, it's a nationality, but they didn't have a particular state. They weren't all in one area, they were spread across the world. But to deal with the historic animosity of much of Europe at different points to their Jewish populations, what's described as anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish feeling, the Zionist movement emerged, and as offering a solution to say, look, the only solution for Jews who live as minorities and who are persecuted is for them to have a state of their own. So that's essentially what Zionism was. It's a movement that arose in Europe at the beginning of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, at a time when Europe was very much thinking about nationalism, because the big empires were breaking up as the smaller nations within asserted themselves. And anti-Semitism was a big issue in Europe, but also colonialism was a big issue. The Europeans had colonized most of the world, and so the Zionist movement emerged saying we want a state, and in the context of European colonization, they said, well, we'll have a state over there in Palestine. The problem was that if you're going to create a Jewish state in a country which the majority are non-Jewish, as I said, mostly Muslim and Christians as well, and say it's going to be a Jewish state, then you're telling these people that they will always be second class in a Jewish state. So this goes back a fair way. Historically, Arabs and Jews haven't been enemies. So this is a modern conflict born of European colonization by the Zionist movement. And the Zionist movement was able to get British government support in 1917 at the same time that Britain captured Palestine. They were able to get the support of the British government for a Jewish home, as they called it, but intending it to be a state in Palestine. And then you had a period between the First and the Second World War when Britain ran Palestine. They were given that authority by the precursor to the United Nations, a body called the League of Nations, and they were supposed to guide Palestine to independence. But at the same time, they had made a commitment to the Zionist movement that they would establish a Jewish state. And so in that interwar period, from 1917 onwards, massive Jewish immigration from Europe occurred into Palestine. So that by the time we go through the Second World War and we get to 1948, a third of the population are Jewish in Palestine, and 2/3 of them are born overseas, almost all in Europe. And at this stage, the British Empire is on its knees because of the cost of the Second World War, and the Zionist movement in Palestine is insisting on a Jewish state, and the Palestinians are saying we're the majority and we're the native people, we want self-determination. And so the issue was given to the United Nations, which put forward a proposal for a very unjust partition, which the Palestinians rejected as being unreasonable. And a war ensued where the Israelis took 78% of Palestine. And the Israel that is officially recognised around the world is this state created in 1948 on 78% of Palestine. And what we today call the occupied territories, the West Bank of the Jordan River, East Jerusalem and Gaza, these were the territories that Israel didn't take in 1948.
Okay.
And so for 20 years, the Palestinians were hoping to get those that were expelled in 1948, because half the Palestinian population were expelled in 1948 from what became Israel. And for 20 years they hoped to return. Well,
They call it first Nakba in
yes.
1948.
So 1948, the Palestinians call the catastrophe, which is in Arabic al-Nakba. And then in 1967, what's known as the Six-Day War, because that's how long it went for, meant that Israel took the rest of Palestine. And so thereafter, people stopped talking as much about the Palestinians that were displaced in 48, having a right to go back to their homes. They started saying, okay, well, maybe we should talk about a two-state solution. Israel for the Jews on 78% of Palestine, and a Palestinian state on the remaining 22%, West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza. So that was an option that was held up for many years. The problem was that from the time Israel took these territories in 1967, they began to colonise them. And that colonisation has never stopped until today.
And what has UN played in this conflict? Because it looks like it's not doing what it's supposed to do. Every time if there is any resolution against Israel on the table, it's been vetoed by US or other powers.
Yeah.
So what do you think UN can do in this something? Or
the UN from the beginning has had limitations. The United Nations has many organisations within it that do a lot of very, very good work. But at the top of the United Nations is the Security Council. Now, the Security Council has about a dozen rotating members, and they have 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And these are the victors of the Second World War. So you have the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China and Russia. Now, the significance of these 5 permanent members is that they have the right of veto over decisions. The other members of the UN come in and they serve a period of time, but they don't have this right of veto. The right of veto in the Security Council is important because it means that if the United Nations wishes to enact sanctions against a country, or if they wish to deploy armed force against a country, the permanent members have to be in agreement. The United States will rarely allow a resolution that the Israelis don't like to pass.
Okay.
So people will argue that the UN must act because Israel is infringing that law or this law, or they're not abiding by previous resolutions. But without enforcement, the resolutions and international law become meaningless. And the United States has been historically the chief defender of not Israel's right so much as Israel being unaccountable, because they're almost never held to account for things that the international community recognises as acts of aggression or infringements of international law. And that's the internal realities of the United States are what make it a negative player in the United Nations.
United States or Western countries in general, why do they support Israel? There are two arguments. One is like Israel is an outpost of United States in Middle East, and it just serves its imperial interest in that area. Other argument is there is a powerful Israeli lobby in US
Yes.
and Western countries, and they just influence their politics and make them make decisions in Israel's favor. Which argument you buy in these two?
Look, both things are true. The United States can call on Israel to act as its local policeman if it needs it. But the other argument is also true, that the Israel lobby in the United States is one of the most powerful lobbies. And it has been that way really since the foundation of Israel in 1948. It's been very influential. And to the extent that it will encourage the Americans to act not just in respect to Israel and Palestine, but in the Middle East as a whole. It will encourage the Americans to act in a way that is detrimental to America's interest, but suits Israel's interests. And what we've seen recently, because of the genocide in Gaza, which is now almost 2 years old, we've seen many people in the United States, both on the left and on the right, re-evaluating their attitude to Israel, to its lobby, and particularly looking at the power of the lobby over the United States government. And I'll give you a couple of examples. When Donald Trump was elected, one of the things that he campaigned on was that he was against wars of intervention. So the United States had invaded Iraq in 2003 on a false pretense that Iraq had nuclear weapons, which they knew they didn't have, and which that was found to be the case. Other interventions in the Middle East have been at the prompting of the Israelis, including Iraq. And we've got, video footage anyone can see online of Netanyahu saying, America must destroy Iraq. The path to democracy in the Middle East will come when the Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein is gone. All these lies, which were beneficial for Israel in that Israel has an ambition to dominate the region, but terrible for the region, for the countries of the region, and terrible for the US, because the US was embroiled in the Iraq war. They spent trillions on it, trillions of dollars, not just billions, that they could have spent on fixing infrastructure in the United States, which has been in decline, particularly in its manufacturing sector and infrastructure across the country. So American money on a horrendous, huge scale was wasted in Iraq. American lives were wasted. American prestige in the region plummeted. It was seen as a war of aggression, and the cost to the Iraqis was terrible. Over a course of a couple of decades between sanctions and wars, probably in excess of 2 million Iraqis died out of a population of about 20 million, which was roughly what Australia's population was. So this was the backdrop when Trump came into power. People had seen the George Bush administration from 2008 engage in this invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan and other military adventures. The Barack Obama regime undermined some governments in Libya and in Syria. And Trump came to power saying, we need to look after America first. We don't want foreign wars that take our soldiers' lives and drain our resources. And then with the Gaza genocide, what the American public saw was firstly the Democrat administration under Biden, and then the Trump administration giving a continuous supply of bombs to Israel, which was clearly decimating a Palestinian population that was defenseless and couldn't flee. And so they saw the American government as party to a genocide. And then we had Israel attacking Iran. Now, they attacked them on the basis that they were getting close to a nuclear weapon. Now, again, anybody who can get onto YouTube can see videos of Benjamin Netanyahu from 25 or more years ago saying the same things about Iran that he said about Iraq. They're just a few months away from the bomb. Yeah. They're 1 year away from the bomb. You've got to attack them. Now, the incredible thing about this is that Israel has the bomb. Israel has been a nuclear power since 1969. The CIA acknowledges it and other countries recognise it, but its nuclear program is not acknowledged by Israel or the US government. It's a secret program. Yeah. But they have a nuclear weapon, so they cannot be defeated militarily. But they are making a case that if anyone else is trying to get one, it's a cause for war. And if the other countries aren't trying to get one, they can still assert that they're trying to get one. They can still claim they're trying to get a weapon. And people say, oh, that's terrible, and ignoring the fact that Israel is already a nuclear power. So Israel attacks Iran, and then the US is drawn in to it. And for a lot of Trump's supporters, they saw a president who they had voted for to keep them out of foreign wars, not just supporting a genocide for a foreign state and giving them billions and billions of dollars in arms and in other things, but they saw the American president allowing himself to be drawn into a war against a country of 90 million people in Iran that hadn't threatened the United States and wasn't threatening American interests, but was a target of Israeli ambition. So you have a split in what they describe as the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again, Trump's movement, where some people who were previously Trump supporters are saying, look, you know, the United States is being used by Israel. We're destroying countries overseas, killing people for no good reason. We're sending them the bombs. This has destroyed America's reputation. Trump has lied to the American people when he said he wasn't going to be involved in foreign wars. And on top of that, they're saying the power of the Israel lobby in our country is a detrimental thing. That they are not working in the interest of the American government, but they are working in the interest of the Israeli government, even if it harms the United States. So this is a very significant split in Trump's supporter base. And the same thing is happening on the left. Historically, both major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, have been fairly tightly controlled by the Zionist lobby, which is hugely powerful. They're controlled through funding of the parties, of donations at election time, whether congressional or presidential. These are a matter of public record, that the biggest donors quite often, or amongst the biggest donors, are pro-Israeli donors who announce what their policies are. So people have seen the power of the lobby and they're rejecting it. So within the Democrat Party, on the left of the Democrat Party, there's people now saying this is a genocide, we should be stopping it, not enabling it, and the lobby is part of the problem. On the right of the Republican Party, we're seeing people saying the same thing, that making America great is not about destroying foreign countries and impoverishing America. It should be about putting America first. So there are people that are in the media establishment who are very influential, like Tucker Carlson, people like that, who he had 5 million, an audience of 5 or 6 million a night on Fox News.
You know? 4 point some million.
Huge, the biggest audience for cable news. Now he's come out and he said the Israel lobby is the problem. The Israel lobby is undermining our democracy. They need to be called out for it, that is identified for what they do, and their policies need to be rejected. In New York, Zoran Mamdani manages to get through the primary selection process for governor, and governor or mayor, but he's
Mayor of
New York, sorry.
Yeah.
And it's remarkable because New York is a very Jewish city. It has a very big Jewish population.
And he got more votes in the areas where there are more Jews
Yes.
there.
So traditionally, both the mayor and the governor of New York, New York City and New York State respectively, are very pro-Israel, because the lobby has told them the Jewish population wants a pro-Israel approach. So we had that famous scene where in the primaries, which were televised, the journalists were asking the candidates, which country will you visit if you're elected? And every one of them said, oh, my first visit will be to Israel.
Yeah.
Except for Mamdani, who said, I'm not going anywhere, my work is here in New York amongst the people of New York.
And moreover, he said, if Netanyahu comes to New York, I will arrest him.
Yes, he did. He did. So these things are unprecedented, both on the left and the right. And people in the in positions of power, people at the top of journalism, are now openly criticising Israel in a way that was unthinkable before the genocide. So there's reason for optimism that this may be a turning point, because if the power of the Israel lobby can be curbed, then the United States, as an international actor, may be able to act in a manner that brings peace closer. And I say that because the reality between Israel and Palestine is that there's a huge imbalance of power. The Palestinians have no substantial military. The Israelis are the strongest military power. The Israelis occupy all the Palestinian territories. They can arrest anybody at any time. They can kill anybody at any time. They have a huge surveillance state. When you negotiate with somebody, if they have everything and you have nothing, it's very hard to come up with something that's fair. So the imbalance of power has been supported by the United States for decades and decades. Unless the United States and the international community generally is prepared to put pressure on Israel through diplomatic means, through economic means, whatever it takes, through the United Nations, to abide by the peace agreement they signed 30 years ago, then the future is one of apartheid, as I said, a system designed to keep the Israeli Jewish population supreme over everyone else, or military dictatorship, or dispossession, more of what's happening in Gaza. It's not inconceivable that what's happening in Gaza, what we've seen for 2 years, could happen in the West Bank. Every day, Israeli settlers attack Palestinians in the West Bank. Several times in the last 2 years, the Israeli government has announced more Israeli Jewish settlements in the West Bank. So they are openly announcing that they will continue to colonize and explicitly saying there will not be a Palestinian state. So this is a recipe for conflict. And so when we look at Hamas on October 7th, we look at it in the context of what the Palestinians have endured, the situation they've been under, the fact that no international mechanism or actor has been able to change that, and that the future is looking much the same unless the international community can act in a decisive way.
You mentioned G word, genocide. So generally, genocide, massacre, these terms are interchangeably used. So what are the technical points what Israel is doing makes it genocide?
It's essentially about a deliberate attempt to destroy in whole or in part a population. And so the actions of the Israelis have involved both massive military attack on civilians who have no defence and nowhere to flee to. They have involved attacks on every Palestinian hospital in Gaza. So people are being bombed, shot, burned. People are being killed and injured in huge numbers, and then the health system, which should exist to save them, is being destroyed. Medical supplies are being blocked from coming in, and they have from the beginning. Water is blocked from being brought in. Food is being stopped from coming in. So this goes beyond the war between Israel and armed Palestinian fighters of Hamas. This is clearly targeting the civilian population in a lethal way. And this has been documented both by people there and by international observers looking at all the relevant factors. The attacks on the policy of blockading food from coming in. All of us remember the lines of trucks waiting outside the Gaza border, hundreds and hundreds of trucks that weren't allowed to bring in supplies to Gaza. They can be food, they can be medications, they can be tents, they can be anything, the essentials of life. So we've seen a blockade of Gaza of all essential items. We've seen a starvation policy. We've seen the policy of destruction of all cultural institutions. Universities have been destroyed, schools have been destroyed, aid distribution centres. In other words, anything that could possibly prop up the Palestinian people is being destroyed. And this destruction is happening in a context where the Israeli government is announcing it's going to do it. And different Israeli ministers have come out with genocidal statements. Statements, for instance, like every Palestinian in Gaza is guilty, or we should drop atomic bombs on them, or torture is okay because it will help us generate collaborators. So many statements, and these have been documented internationally because of the internet and all the various platforms. We can find these things and see them out for ourselves. Israeli government ministers saying things that are genocidal, announcing policies that are genocidal, and then Israeli troops carrying out these policies in a way that everyone can observe. They can see supplies being denied, they can see water being denied, they can see hospitals blown up. When you combine it, it's fairly clear-cut. And as I say, it's even led some Israeli Jewish scholars of the Jewish Holocaust and the Second World War to come out and say this is a genocide. So
Amnesty International.
Absolutely, yes. A very significant organisation and a very significant report. So the grounds for saying it's a genocide are very extensive. It's documented, and each time that these accusations are put, we get denial from the Israeli government and a continuation of the same policies.
Before I come back home in Australia, I just want you to touch the resistance of Palestinians. So, because in the mainstream media, if we look at it, it's just Hamas everywhere. But we have seen, like last year in July, there were 14 Palestinian resistance factions. They signed a declaration in Beijing. It's called Beijing Declaration.
That's right.
So other than Hamas, what are other factions?
Look, historically, just to go back a little bit, when the Palestinians recognised way back at the beginning of the British occupation in 1917, when they recognised that Britain was there to establish a state for European Jews, resistance began. And initially it was petitioning the British monarchy and things like that, trying to use all of the normal avenues for saying we have a grievance, that the wrong thing is being done, we want it solved. But in time it became apparent that nothing was going to move Britain from its support for a Jewish state, and so armed resistance emerged. So between 1936 and 39, a major rebellion occurred in Palestine, and this Arab revolt was suppressed by the British Empire at great cost to the Palestinians. So by the time you get a few years later to the war with the Zionist settlers, the Palestinians had already been fairly badly smashed by the might of the British Empire. So after Israel was established in 48, the Palestinians as a community were more or less in a state of shock, and neighbouring countries like Jordan and Egypt controlled their affairs because of the way that the war ended in 48. But by the mid-60s, resistance by the Palestinians started to emerge. And these were mostly secular movements. So they would be the movements that later went on to become the Palestine Liberation Organisation. So mostly secular movements, and with a commitment to armed resistance, guerrilla warfare. With this was in the mid-60s. With the 67 war, Israel occupied the rest of Palestine, and so this resistance increased. And for at least a couple of decades, the Palestinian resistance was different secular groups. But then in the late 80s, a religious group emerged, which was Hamas. And other groups emerged, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a number of groups. And sometimes they would cooperate and sometimes they wouldn't. But essentially they had a similar recognition that Israel was not going to change its policies, that they were going to keep colonising and keep colonising. And so the resistance then was a mix of secular and religious groupings. And in the 2006 election...
Sorry to interrupt. In 1991, in Oslo, during Oslo Accord, I think there was a big split between the factions over Oslo Accords. Yes, look, there was a split in 91. In 91, the Americans were secretly trying to, and then openly trying to broker some sort of peace agreement. So this is a couple of years before Oslo. But there were some Palestinians that said the Americans are not an honest broker, that the deal we're being offered is essentially one that will only benefit Israel in the long run. So there were deep divisions amongst the Palestinians in that period, and then over the Oslo Accords as well. Now that was across the spectrum of political parties and resistance groups, and those that were sceptical about Oslo have proved to be right, because the Israelis never stopped colonising. But the Palestinian Authority that was set up in 93 by Oslo as part of the Oslo Peace Accords, the first elections were dominated by the secular groups, so grouped under the PLO umbrella. And they, after a few years, it became apparent to the Palestinian population that the peace deal wasn't delivering peace, it was just delivering more Israeli settlers into the Palestinian territories. And so in the 2006 election, a religious group called Hamas got elected over all of Palestine, West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza. And it was a fair election, monitored by international monitors. But then the Israelis and the Americans found a way to get the Hamas and the secular groups into a fight. And the result of that fight was that the Palestinian Authority, controlled by, again by the PLO, controlled the West Bank, and Hamas was left in control of Gaza. This is how the split emerged in who controls what at the moment. So all of the groups, whether religious or secular, have faced the same basic problem, in that Israel is unaccountable. It is so powerful it does not have to make concessions. And even within Israel, 40 years ago there was
what they called the peace camp. Those Israelis that said, look, we don't want to have permanent war, we've got to make peace with the Palestinians. There isn't a peace camp in Israel anymore. Even the genocide has majority support in Israel. And so it's looking clearer and clearer now that the only way that Israel, which is the far more powerful of the two parties, the only way that they will make concessions, which they have to do because they control everything, everything is in their hands, the only way they'll make concessions is with international pressure. So this is the reality that we're seeing, but instead of international pressure being put on Israel, we've seen them carrying out 2 years of genocide. It's way beyond any military campaign. And rather than there being pressure on Israel by the major players in the world, you have words. So China and Russia have said, you must stop this. The Americans have said, you can have as many bombs as you like. And Western Europe has restricted itself to words, as has the Australian government.
Yeah, I was coming to Australian government. It was said on during the protest, and like if we look at Australian government, it's going to recognize Palestine as a state. But still, why do you think still it's complicit in what Israel is doing?
Australia's foreign policy is towards Israel is constrained by at least three major factors. The first is the Israel lobby, which is very powerful in this country. The second is the Murdoch press.
Australia's former foreign minister mentioned that he had
yes,
Bob Carr.
Yes, which is fairly significant. I mean, Bob Carr was a former state premier and then a foreign minister under the Gillard government. He was the founder of the Labor Friends of Israel in New South Wales. And then after years of working for them said, look, there's a problem here. The Friends of Israel are helping Israel avoid peace and establish an apartheid state. And he became a critic, and he's been very vocal. In Australia, historically, our external ties have been originally with Great Britain, and since the Second World War with the United States. The United States has a very powerful Israel lobby, which influences US foreign policy to the extent of they will tell other governments how they can behave towards Israel. So a major constraint is our alliance with the United States. Australian governments are very nervous about disagreeing with the United States because they fear that the public will think that the alliance is shaky. The Israel lobby in this country is very powerful, and the media, especially the sections controlled by Rupert Murdoch, who's Australian originally but is now an American citizen. He controls the Australian newspaper. In Adelaide it's the Advertiser, and there's other state publications. And Fox News, Sky News, they're all Rupert Murdoch. He's a very hardline supporter of Israel. Now, these are very real constraints on the Australian government. And they've been, on the surface, saying they believe in a two-state solution, that is, they're giving lip service to the Palestinian right to self-determination on that 22% of their country, West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem. But in practice, they've done nothing. So when we've gone and spoken with Penny Wong as Foreign Minister, and we've said to her, look, you support a two-state solution, you say you do, you say that that's the path to peace, and yet every day we see that the Israelis are settling the territories that are supposed to be a Palestinian state. How do you reconcile that? You know, do you recognise that unless you put pressure on Israel, then your words will do nothing? Well, they've been reluctant to do that. They still haven't put pressure on Israel in terms of sanctions, except on a couple of individual settlers who were involved in violence. This is a drop in the ocean, particularly when you compare it with the response to Russia and the Russia-Ukraine war. So the Australian government has been extraordinarily weak before the genocide. In the genocide, they have been appalling. It seems that there's no red line that Israel cannot cross with impunity. So Israel can destroy hospitals not a problem. Israel can kill journalists, over 200 killed now, not a problem. They can kill healthcare workers. They can bomb aid stations. They can, cut off food and water. All of these things are war crimes at the very least, and in combination, a genocide. And yet the Australian government has been very weak. So we'll get our foreign minister saying things that do not reflect what ordinary Australians feel and believe. She is out of step with ordinary Australians. But she'll be told that Israel has done this or that crime, and she'll say, oh, we've told them to abide by international law. So it's like somebody is being killed in the next street. You send a policeman, you don't send a note to the killer saying, please abide by the law. So the Australian government has been extraordinarily weak. For years, we've asked them to recognise Palestine because it was clear that Israel was attempting to erase Palestine from the map. And we thought that recognition at least becomes a line, a foothold for the Palestinians, so they won't be completely erased, a line that Israel can't erase. And but they wouldn't do it. Now, after 2 years of genocide, they're talking about recognition. And there's going to the UN in September, and there'll be debate about recognition. But now they are offering words, and they're offering recognition in the midst of a genocide that is ongoing. Instead of offering action to save lives, they are offering words and nothing more than words, because recognition will not do anything, if it passes, will not do anything to stop what Israel is doing now. And so we see the actions and statements of the Australian government in that context. Recognition before would have been meaningful. Recognition in the midst of a genocide is stepping away from responsibility to act against a genocide. It's a cover for doing nothing.
Yeah, I think we have covered enough ground. Any message you want to leave to our audience as an ordinary Australian citizen, what we can do to stop this human suffering?
Yeah, look, I think most Indians understand the impact of colonialism. India fought for a very long time to free itself. And today, the most devastating colonial enterprise is the Israeli settlement of Palestine. And it's the cause of not just the conflict in Palestine, but across the Middle East. Israeli desire to settle all of Palestine and to dominate the region and the neighbouring countries. Australia has an ability to act as an international citizen if it stands by the agreements we've signed and the conventions we believe in about human rights and international law and the Security Council resolutions. And Australian citizens have, I think, an obligation to make the Australian government abide by the things it claims to believe in. And so our advocacy and that of other Palestine solidarity groups is about mobilising people to both understand the reality of the conflict, but also to act, to go to their politicians, to say to them, this is what Australia stands for, this is what's happening, you need to stand by your values and stop what's happening. So we want people to get engaged with Palestine solidarity, whether it's in protests, whether it's emailing or phoning their members of parliament, whether it's engaging in the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, the BDS movement, which many people see as the only way of pressuring Israel through economic pressure, and it's something that any citizen anywhere in the world can do. So none of us would like to live through what the Palestinians are now living through. None of us would like to see our children living through that. And if it happened to us, we would want to help, and we would want people to help us. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to do something about what's happening to the Palestinians and to do something now. And so I would encourage people to get more information either from our organisation or from others, and act. Act as a citizen, whether you're in Australia or overseas, and act in the interests of humanity.
Thank you very much, Mike, for this important conversation. And for audience, thanks for watching this show, and stay connected and keep yourself aware of all these issues which we bring you with every episode. Thank you.